All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tuleyome's April Nature and You lecture. My name is Jeff Ben. I'm the Education Associate at Tuleyome. If you don't know, Tuleyome is a small conservation nonprofit based in Woodland, California. Our mission is to engage in advocacy and active stewardship with diverse communities to conserve, enhance, restore, and enjoy the lands in the region. The region that we focus on is the northern inner coast range and neighboring areas of the Central Valley. We particularly focus on the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument, which we helped lead the effort to get established back in 2015 and then to get it expanded in 2024. In addition to our public lands advocacy work, we do a variety of other awesome things, including K-12 field trips for kids. I was just out with a couple of classes of fifth graders this morning. We do some really great natural history articles in our newsletter. And of course, we have this monthly lecture series. We also do a range of adventures programs, including hikes, trail building days, wildflower tours, and our youth boot bank, which provides free loans of hiking boots to kids. If you'd like to learn more about these or any of our other projects, you can do so on our website, tuleyome.org. All right, on to tonight's lecture. This lecture series is supported in part by donations from folks like you. So if you haven't done so already and you're in a position to be able to do so, we greatly appreciate a donation to help support all the good work that we do. We are very lucky tonight to have Dan Ruka with us. Dan recently completed a master's in ecology at UC Davis, where his research focused on the impact of wildfire on black bears in California. He recently started a position as a member of the bear management team at Yellowstone National Park, which he is going to be presenting live from tonight. And so tonight he is going to be talking to us about bears in California. During the talk, we ask that you keep yourselves on mute and hang on to any questions until the end, at which point we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. All right, Dan, you can take it away.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Can everyone hear me okay? Perfect. All right, let's see here. Okay. All right. Well, thanks everyone for being here tonight. I really appreciate you all taking the time for coming out for this. Thanks to Jeff for reaching out and setting this up. This is going to be a lot of fun. So, like Jeff said, my name is Dan Ruka, and tonight I'm going to be talking about California black bears, specifically their ecology, how we can coexist with them, and how large wildfires are starting to reshape bear populations. So this talk is going to be a mix of science, but also a lot of real-world experience working directly with bears in places like Lassen, Sequoia, and now Yellowstone. So just a little bit about me to start. So I recently finished my master's degree at UC Davis, where I studied black bears in Lassen Volcanic National Park. But before that, I spent several years working in the field, mostly with large mammals. I've worked in Lassen, Sequoia, and Kings Canyon, and now I'm currently out in Yellowstone working in bear management. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight isn't just coming from research papers. It's coming from actually working with these animals on the ground, seeing how they behave, and dealing with real world situations as they come up. And I think that's important because bears are one of those species where the science and the day-to-day management really overlap. One of the first times I really worked close with a black bear, I was standing right next to a sedated bear during a capture. And it's kind of a surreal moment because you're looking at an animal that, when it's awake, is incredibly powerful, fast, strong, something you normally keep a very safe distance from. And now you're right next to it. You notice things you wouldn't normally think about, like how big their paws are, how thick their fur is, just how massive they actually are. And it really changes your perspective. It goes from being this abstract idea of a bear to something very real. And for me, that was one of the moments where I realized I wanted to work with these animals long term. So I didn't actually start out planning to work with wildlife. I originally went out into forestry, and I also worked as a wildland firefighter for a while. And I liked being outdoors. I liked working in these landscapes, but over time I realized I was more interested in the animals using those systems than the trees themselves. My first real experience with bear research was in Wisconsin, where I did my undergrad. There I helped track bears and I assisted with field work doing bear captures. And that was really my introduction to wildlife research. From there, I worked a series of different jobs across the country. Deer work in West Virginia, carnivore work in California, and over time, I kept coming back to large mammals. And eventually, I realized that working with bears combined a lot of themes I was interested in: behavior, ecology, and also human-wildlife interactions. And that's really what led me into the research I'm going to talk about later. So, before we get into anything more complex, let's start with some basic black bear biology. First, despite the name, not all black bears are actually black. In California, you can see a wide range of colors, like these different colors you see here of these bears. They can be black, brown, cinnamon, even blonde. And that's something a lot of people don't expect. Another important thing is that black bears are extremely adaptable. They can live in conifer forests, mixed forests, even areas that are relatively open, as long as they have access to food and some level of cover. They're also what we call generalists, which basically means they're not picky. They can use a wide range of resources and habitats depending on what's available. And part of that flexibility comes from their diet. So they're omnivores. They eat a mix of berries, plants, insects, and occasionally meat. We'll talk a little more about that in a minute, but the key idea is that they can adjust what they eat depending on what's available. And in terms of reproduction, female bears typically have cubs every other year. So population growth tends to be relatively slow compared to a lot of other species. And that combination, being adaptable but also reproducing slowly, is one of the reasons black bears can persist in changing environments, but also still be vulnerable to large disturbances. Most people think of bears as strictly wilderness animals, but they're actually much more flexible than that. In California, black bears are found across a large portion of the state. As you can see from this map, approximately 90% of the population actually resides in the North Coast, this area here, the Cascade, which is about this area here, and the Sierra Nevada regions. That's 90% of the population of black bears. But what's really important is that bear populations are expanding. Population numbers have significantly increased from the 10 to 15,000 in the early 1980s to the estimated 49 to 71,000 today. We're seeing more bears moving into areas where people live, into foothills, rural communities, even near suburban areas. So the overlap between humans and bears is increasing, and that's a big reason why understanding coexistence is so important. So I just want to do a quick poll from the audience here. You can just write in the chat saying you did or when you did. How many of you have actually seen a black bear in the wild? All right. Yeah, it looks like a lot of you have. Awesome. Great. Yeah. And seems like a lot of you have, and that's awesome. And for those of you who haven't, there's still a good chance that you've been in areas where bears were nearby. You just didn't see them. All right. Okay. So when we talk about what bears eat, One of the biggest misconceptions is that they're primarily meat eaters. In reality, about 90% of their diet is plant-based. They rely heavily on things like berries, grasses, nuts, and other vegetation. They also eat insects, things like ants and grubs, which are actually an important protein source for them. And they will eat meat occasionally, but it's usually opportunistic, like scavenging rather than actively hunting. But the key idea here isn't just what they eat, it's how they eat. Bears spend a huge portion of their day foraging, especially in late summer and fall when they're trying to build fat reserves before winter. They can be eaten almost constantly, so they're always looking for food. And that's important when we start talking about human bear interactions. Because from a bear's perspective, any food source, natural or human, becomes part of the constant search. So, why should we care about black bears? Beyond just being an iconic species, they actually play a really important role in ecosystems. They help disperse seeds across the landscape when they eat fruit and move around. They influence vegetation patterns, and they're often considered what's called an indicator species, which just means that if bears are doing well, it usually suggests that the ecosystem as a whole is functioning well because they require large areas, diverse food sources, and relatively intact habitat. So when we see changes in bear populations, it's often a signal that something bigger is happening in the ecosystem. And that's exactly what got me interested in looking at wildfire in bears, because wildfire is one of the biggest forces shaping these landscapes right now. But when bears come into towns, neighborhoods, or campgrounds, it's always almost about one thing: food. And from a bear's perspective, human food is incredibly valuable. Think about it this way. Bears spend most of their day searching for food. They're constantly moving, constantly foraging, burning a lot of energy. So when they come across something like a trash can, a cooler, sometimes a dumpster, or even pet food left outside, that's a huge payoff for very little effort. It's high calorie, easy to access, and often predictable. And bears are really good learners. If they find food in one place, they'll come back. If they find it again, they'll keep coming back. So a single unsecured trash can or one bad camping setup might not seem like a big deal, but from a bear's perspective, it can be the start of a pattern. And once that pattern starts, it can be very hard to break. That brings us to this idea of habituation. Habituation basically means that a bear loses its natural fear of humans. At first, a bear might avoid people completely. Then maybe it starts showing up at night. Then maybe it starts coming around during the day. And over time, it becomes more and more comfortable being close to people. And this is where things start to get risky because a bear that isn't afraid of people is much more likely to get into conflict situations. And unfortunately, once a bear reaches that point, the outcome is often not good for the bear. A fed bear is often a dead bear. And that's not just a saying. In many cases, if a bear repeatedly gets into human food, damages property, or becomes a safety concern, managers may have to remove that animal. So, what starts as something small, like leaving food out, can eventually lead to really serious consequences. So, what should you actually do if you see a bear? The first thing is to stay calm. Most black bears do not want anything to do with people. They're usually just trying to avoid you. So if you encounter one, don't run. Running can trigger a chase response. Instead, you want to stand your ground. Make yourself look bigger and slowly back away. Yelling "Hey bear" is actually really good too as well. And it also lets other people know in the area that there is a bear in the area. But also make sure you give the bear space. Let it move off on its own. And in most cases, that's exactly what will happen. The key idea here is that you don't want to escalate the situation. You just want to create distance and avoid surprising the animal. So when you're camping in bear country, what you do matters a lot. Bears have an incredible sense of smell, actually 7 times stronger than a bloodhound. They can detect food from long distances, and they're very good at tracking it down. So things like food storage become extremely important. Using bear canisters, keeping a clean campsite, and never storing your food in your tent are all basic but critical steps. And this isn't just about protecting your food. It's about preventing bears from learning that campsites are a food source. I once came across a campsite where food had been left out overnight, and it was pretty clear that a bear had already been through. Things were scattered around, containers had been moved, the whole site looked disturbed. And the problem at that point isn't just that someone lost their food, it's that the bear now has learned something. It's learned that the campsites equal food. And once a bear learns that, it's very likely to come back and to try again. So, really, a lot of bear management starts with people. Preventing that first mistake is one of the most important things we can do. So, one of the ways we try to deal with these situations as bear managers is through bear management. And a big part of that is something called hazing. Hazing is basically using non-lethal deterrents to teach bears to avoid people in developed areas. The goal isn't to hurt the bear. The goal is to create a negative experience so that the bear chooses to stay away in the future. I'm going to show you a short clip of what that looks like. So what you saw there is something I did pretty regularly. We'd have bears that were repeatedly coming into campgrounds or developed areas or a picnic area that you see here. And at first, they might run off easily, but over time, if they keep finding food, they get bolder. They don't run as quickly. They come back sooner. And that's when we step in. We use things like noise, projectiles, or other deterrents to try to reestablish that natural fear of humans. Because if we don't, those situations can escalate. And eventually it can reach a point where the bear has to be removed. So even though what you saw might look a little intense, it's actually a way to prevent a worse outcome later. And in a lot of ways, that's what bear management is about. It's not just reacting to problems, it's trying to prevent them from getting worse. All right, so before I get into my own research, I want to start with an important point, which is that fire itself is not automatically bad. In fact, fire is a natural and necessary part of many ecosystems in the Western United States. Historically, many forests in California burned fairly regularly, but those fires were often lower in intensity. They helped recycle nutrients back into the soil, clear out built up vegetation, and create space for new plant growth. And that new growth can be really important for wildlife. After a fire, you can sometimes get a flush of grasses, shrubs, flowers, and berry producing plants. That can create food for a wide range of animals, including black bears. Fire can also create more habitat diversity across the landscape. Instead of everything being the same, you end up with a patchwork of different conditions. Some more open, some still forested, some recently burned, some older. and that kind of variety can actually be beneficial for many species. So I think it's really important to start here because sometimes when people hear the word wildfire, they immediately think total destruction. And sometimes that's true, but fire by itself is not the enemy. Fire has always been part of these systems. The problem is that the kinds of fires we're seeing more often today are not always the same as the fires these ecosystems evolved with. And that brings us to megafires. So when people talk about megafires, they're usually talking about fires that are larger, more severe, and more destructive across huge areas. So the difference is not just that the fire is big, it's also that it can burn hotter, remove much more forest structure, and affect entire landscapes all at once. Historically, many fire-prone forests would burn in a more mixed pattern. Some areas would burn lightly, some more intensely, and some patches would remain relatively intact. That created a mosaic across the landscape. But megafires can overwhelm that pattern. Instead of leaving lots of smaller patches of living forest mixed with burned areas, they can create very large zones where the canopy is gone, the structure is simplified, and the habitat changes dramatically. That matters for bears because black bears are adaptable, but they still rely on structure. They rely on cover. They rely on forested habitat for movement, shelter, thermal refuge, and access to certain food resources. So again, it's not just fire in general that I'm interested in here. It's the shift towards these much larger, more severe fires that can restructure a landscape very quickly. And that raises an important question. How do black bears respond when that kind of large-scale change happens? The answer is that fire can affect bears in both positive and negative ways. On the positive side, burned areas can create new food resources. As vegetation regrows, bears may benefit from more berries, more herbaceous plants, and more insects. Down logs can hold grubs and other insects that bears will feed on. So, in some cases, burned landscapes can actually become productive foraging areas. But there are also clear costs. High severity fire can remove forest cover and simplify the landscape. That means less shelter, fewer cool shaded areas, and potentially fewer denning opportunities. It can also affect the availability of certain foods that bears rely on in forested habitats. So what you end up with is a trade-off. A burned landscape may offer some new feeding opportunities, especially in patches that are regenerating. But if too much structure is lost, or if the fire burns too severely across too much of the landscape, bears may lose important habitat features they still depend on. And I think that's one of the biggest themes of this whole talk. Black bears are adaptable, but adaptability has limits. They can use disturbed areas, they can take advantage of new food sources, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're unaffected. So, going into my research, one of the big questions was whether the benefits and costs of fire would balance out, or whether a mega fire would cause a bigger negative shift in the bear population. So, the fire I focused on was the Dixie Fire. This was one of the largest wildfires in California history. And in 2021, it burned through a huge portion of Lassen Volcanic National Park. About 70% of that park burned. That is an enormous change for a single landscape. And it didn't burn evenly. As you can see from this map of Lassen, some areas were unburned or very low burn severity, that's the green. Some burned at lower severity, and that's the yellow. Some at moderate severity, the orange. And some at high severity, the red, where much of the forest canopy was removed. So what the park was left with was a patchwork of burned and unburned areas, but across a landscape that had clearly been transformed. For me, this created a really unique research opportunity because there had already been a bear survey in Lassen before the fire. I was able to compare black bears before and after this major disturbance. That kind of before and after setup is actually pretty rare in wildlife research. A lot of times, a major event happens and then researchers start studying it afterward. But in this case, we had information from the landscape before the fire, which meant we could make a much stronger comparison. So, what exactly did I do? I used two main sources of information. First, camera traps. Those helped show where bears were being detected across the landscape. Second, hair samples. At each site, we set up hair snares. That's this white strip here. And when bears passed by, they would sometimes leave hair behind, like this bear here that's checking out my bait. Those samples could then be analyzed for DNA. And that DNA was really important because it allowed us to identify individual bears. So with the cameras, I could look at broad patterns of where bears were still showing up. And with the DNA from the hair samples, I could go a step further and estimate how many individual bears were actually using the landscape. That distinction matters because one theme my research ended up showing is that a species can still be present across much of a landscape, but the actual number of individuals can still decline a lot. So the main goal here was to compare the bear population before and after the Dixie Fire and ask three simple questions. Were bears still present across the landscape? Did the number of bears change? And did the way bears use the landscape change after the fire? So the first major finding was that bears were still present across much of the landscape after the fire. The map on the left here shows bear detections uh, before the fire, and the map on the right shows bear detections after the fire. Bear icons indicate a bear detection, like this guy here. And a blue circle indicates no bear detection. So as you can see, bears were still very present after the fire. That's important because it tells us the fire did not simply wipe bears out of Lassen. They were still being detected across the park, including in burned areas. So at first glance, that might make it seem like the population was doing relatively okay. And that's actually one reason this kind of study is useful. If you only looked at where bears were still showing up, you might conclude that they had been pretty resilient to the fire. And in one sense, they were. Bears are mobile, they're adaptable, and they can continue using landscapes even after major disturbance. But that first result did not tell the whole story because being present is not the same thing as having the same population size. And that leads into the second finding, which was really the big one. So this was the major result of the study. Even though bears were still present across much of the park, there were far fewer of them after the fire. Before the Dixie Fire, we estimated roughly 350 bears in the study area. After the fire, that estimate dropped to around 130 bears. So overall, that's about a 60% decline. That's a substantial change. And I want to pause on that for a second because this is really the key message from the research. If you had only looked at where bears were still occurring, you might think, okay, bears are still around, so maybe the impact wasn't that large. But when we actually look at the number of individuals, we found a major drop. So the takeaway here is that bears were still using the landscape, but fewer individual bears were occupying that landscape. In other words, their footprint across the park looked somewhat similar, but the population filling that footprint had shrunk. That's an important distinction, especially for wildlife monitoring, because sometimes animals can still appear broadly distributed even while the population itself is declining. And from a conservation standpoint, that means you can underestimate the impact of a disturbance if you only look at presence and absence. So this finding told us that the Dixie Fire did not eliminate bears from Lassen, but it likely reduced the population quite a bit. And to me, that was one of the most interesting parts of the whole study. The bears weren't simply gone. They were still there, but the population had clearly changed in a way that you could miss if you only looked at surface level patterns. The third main finding was that bears also seemed to be using the landscape differently after the fire. They appeared to be more concentrated in certain areas, especially places where forest structure remained. So rather than using the burned landscape evenly, they seemed to be relying more on patches that still provided cover and intact habitat. That makes ecological sense. Even though bears can forage in more open, recently burned areas, they still depend on forest structure for movement, for shelter, and for avoiding stress and exposure. And in my research, one of the strongest signals after the fire was the importance of red fir habitat. That suggestion that suggests that remaining forest patches may have been acting as refuges, places where bears could still find cover, cooler conditions, and key habitat features in an otherwise heavily altered landscape. So it wasn't just that there were fewer bears, it was also that the bears that remained were concentrating their activity more tightly in the habitat that was still most usable. That helps explain how two things can be true at the same time. Bears were still broadly present across the park, but the population was smaller and more spatially concentrated. So why does all of this matter? I think it matters for a few reasons. First, it reminds us that black bears are adaptable, but they are not invincible. Sometimes people think of black bears as generalists that can handle anything. And it's true that they're flexible animals, but the study shows that major landscape change can still affect them in important ways. Second, it shows that large wildfires can have real population level effects, not just short-term behavioral changes and not just visual changes to the forest, but actual changes in how many animals are using that system. And third, it highlights the importance of habitat refuges. If surviving patches of intact forests help animals persist after major fires, then those areas may become increasingly important in the future with more frequent and more severe wildfire. So for me, this study is really about more than just bears. It's also about what happens to wildlife when fire changes from being a natural ecological process to becoming a much larger and more severe landscape disturbance. So to wrap up, there are really three take-home messages I want to leave you with tonight. First, human behavior plays a huge role in bear conflict. Most conflicts don't start because bears are aggressive. They start because bears learn that people provide food. Second, wildfire is reshaping ecosystems in real and complicated ways. Fires still can create benefits for wildlife, but the scale and severity of modern megafires can create very different outcomes than the fires these ecosystems historically experienced. And third, coexistence is key. Whether we're talking about reducing bear conflict in campgrounds and communities, or thinking about how wildlife responds to changing landscapes, the big question is how humans and bears continue to share space. And I think black bears are such a compelling species for that conversation because they live right at the intersection of wild ecosystems, human development, and environmental change. All right, that's all I have for tonight. Thanks again for taking the time to listen. I really appreciate it. If any of you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And if anything comes up later, feel free to reach out. This is my contact info up here. But that's all I got. I figure you guys probably have a lot of questions, but thank you.
All right, Dan. Thank you so much for a great talk. And if folks have questions, you can either raise your hand and unmute yourself, or you can type the question in the chat, and I'd be happy to relay it to Dan. We've had a couple of questions in the chat about, what happened to those bears in Lassen. Do you have any data or information on did they relocate to somewhere outside of the Dixie Fire burn scar? Did they perish in the fire? Any indication what happened there?
Well, likely so. Bears being super mobile, black bears, a lot of them probably left when the fire came through. I'm sure a few probably died in the fire. It's probably unavoidable, but most of them probably moved, just translocated to somewhere else. I'm sure they didn't all die. Most of them probably just found somewhere else to live.
Very good. And then there was another question about where you had your kind of camera hair trap station set up. It looked like it was kind of a grid pattern across the park. How did you go about choosing your sites for that?
Yeah, so I actually just replicated the previous study. Some different scientists actually did the study before, and they were for a 3 kilometer grid system is what they were going for with that study. And so I just replicated the same exact sites that they did so I could have the most like sound science and I could compare before and after as exact as possible.
Makes sense. Dale says hunting season regulations have just increased bear take. I'm assuming that's in California. Do you have any thoughts or concerns on that?
Yeah, there are a lot of black bears in California, as I talked about. The population has increased a lot. Um, Hunting is a very important aspect of management of wildlife. I guess like the only concern I have is maybe in some areas, like especially heavily burned areas, like my science shows, maybe a little less take there. But management of large species like these, especially carnivores and things like that, are very important, especially when people and humans are constantly interacting.
Got it. All right. Craig is wondering if bears have compensatory reproduction. So, did you see any change in their rate of reproduction after a population decrease, like with the fire here?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, there was still like obviously cubs after the fire, but there was obviously a lot less individuals that I was picking up on camera, and the population was a lot less. So I don't really think there was like compensatory reproduction. I don't think they were like reproducing more. If anything, maybe less because there's less resources, and then these female bears obviously need more resources to be able to reproduce more offspring. So I can't say for sure. I don't have any science to back that up, but I would guess that equal or less possibly.
Gotcha. Karen is wondering if you ever do any tagging of bears to track their movement.
Yeah, so I've never done that actually with my masters, but I've done it doing bear management stuff for Sequoia National Park, and I've also been doing a Yellowstone National Park as well. Yellowstone, they do it mostly for to track grizzly bear populations here. And in Sequoia, we were mostly keeping track of like nuisance bears. That way, if we tag them and collar them, we can kind of figure out how close they are to like a developed area and try to avoid like any conflicts with humans.
That makes sense. So that's a good lead into another question. Timothy is wondering if you know anything about how bear population density, like in Lassen, compares to some of the other areas in California, like Yosemite, Sequoia, or up by Tahoe.
Yeah, I believe the densities are much lower in Lassen, obviously, especially now after the fire. There was still a good chunk there because obviously I was working there in 2021 before the fire came in. So Still bears, but I mean, I've been in Yosemite and like even Sequoia, there's so many black bears there. I know Tahoe's got a bunch. So I would say the density is definitely way less in those areas for sure.
Mhm. Jessica was wondering if you knew anything about how the Dixie Fire started in the Lassen area. Is that a natural fire, or I don't
Um,
remember?
yeah, I actually heard it. So it started, I think, on my birthday, July 13th in
Oh
2021.
no.
And from what I heard, it was actually by PG&E. They had like a line or something that broke, and I don't know for sure, but that's the rumor I heard that it was actually caused by that. And yeah, I don't think it was a natural fire, but yeah.
All right. So Jeanette has a question that I also was wondering about. So, there's been a fair bit of news recently about the reintroduction of gray wolves into California. So that's, got some people talking about potentially reintroducing grizzly bears into California. Do you have any thoughts or insights on that?
Yeah, I definitely have my opinions on that. It's a tricky like situation. Like obviously in a perfect world, yeah, let's bring grizzly bears back, but with like how many people are in California, their classic habitat would mostly be like in the Central Valley and stuff like that. That's where grizzly bears were back in the day. They were foraging. And obviously there's way too many people there now, and there'd be way too many conflicts. I hope it could work out, but in my personal opinion, I don't think it's a good idea. I think there's just to be a lot of conflicts with just because of like how many people there are already in California.
Right. So Walt has a question. You said you saw an approximately a 60% decline in the bear population. How does that compare to like the percentage of the landscape that was like severely burned?
How does it compare to the landscape? So I'm trying to remember the percent of that was high severity. I think it was probably like 10 to 20% of the landscape was high severity burn, like that red area that I
Hmm.
was talking about. So if we can go back to the map, actually, I can. Oh, here we go. So bears are still showing up in those areas, but obviously the fire like decreased the population a lot because there's probably obviously there's not as good as habitat and stuff like that. So I guess I'm not really sure what that question's asking, but yeah, that's what I got, I guess.
Great. So we've got a question from one of our younger listeners here. So Timothy says that his daughter's asking, a wild bear came to our school, which was about 5 miles west of Davis yesterday. Is this rare? What do you think might be driving that?
Ah, interesting. Yeah. I have heard about like bears being around like UC Davis and stuff like that. Not very often. I think before I started my master's there, they actually had a black bear that came through and they had to like capture it and translocate it. If you think about
Hmm.
it, we're pretty close in Davis and like Woodland area, pretty close to like the coastal mountains there. And there's definitely black bears there. So I think it was probably likely a young black bear dispersing male or something like that, trying to find a new like landscape or new home, whatever. And it just happened to wander through there. I mean, that's like what I'm saying. Like we're gonna have to learn to coexist with black bears because like their population is expanding so much in California.
All right. So Gavin has a question about kind of camping safety and food. He says that he's seen some people recommend keeping bear canisters closer to tents so that disturbances are harder to miss if a bear tries to get it. What are your thoughts on that? Is that worthwhile as a way to dissuade the bears, or is it better to keep that canister fairly far away from your tent?
Yeah, I think backpacking for sure. Keep that further away. I mean, unless you want the bear to be, I guess, checking you out while you sleep, whatever. I mean, because if you keep it closer to your tent, then the bear is going to be closer to you, obviously. The big thing is you don't want to put the canister next to like a cliff or something like that because you don't want the bear to knock it over the cliff or something. But I would
Hmm.
definitely make sure you keep it a good distance from your tent. I think what do I say? The 70 yards is the proper distance. Yeah, 70 big steps. That's what it is. Yeah. So yeah, I would definitely try to stay with that. You don't want the bears possibly checking out your tent in case, because any kind of scent can actually make them curious. So like, say you got like a candle in there or deodorant, like that can even draw them in sometimes. So I would definitely keep your canister away from your tent.
Right. Terry is asking, in your photos, it looks like the bears are checking things out on a tree. Are those cameras? What are they looking at there?
Oh yeah, let's see. This one or probably this one. These photos and also these photos are from my study. So like what I mentioned before, like if you see here, this is the bait that draws them in and like the kind of scent, whatever. And this is why the bear is coming in. Same with this bear. This bear is coming to check out this bait and scented lure here. And this is the hair snare here. That's why they're coming in there. Just checking out my bait, and that's I'm just trying to be able to get more detections and determine if bears are there or not.
Very good. So Jeanette is asking about kind of thinking about with the wolf reintroductions. Have you heard anything about impacts of the wolves on black bear populations or behavior in California?
Yeah, as far as I know, there's like really no impact at all. I mean, I know like when working in Lassen, there was obviously wolf packs outside the park mostly. They didn't really come into the park because it's not great wolf habitat. Um, yeah, it's like they're looking for those open areas, and Lassen had a lot of mostly wooded areas. And obviously after the burn and everything like that, they just don't, or at least in Lassen, they didn't really cross paths and yeah, I mean, I'm sure they probably interact in the wild, but black bears just being eating or like veggies all the time and stuff like that. They're just scavengers. Like, I don't think they really interact or cross paths that much.
Okay. Jay was wondering about what is one of your favorite or most memorable experiences with bears, either in your research or otherwise.
It's a good question, huh? Well, I remember one, I guess this is memorable, not really like fun, but it was kind of scary. In Sequoia. We had to close down this trail for a little bit, and there was a sow, which is a mama black bear with a cub, and she was probably about 10 to 15 yards off the trail. And I was kind of taking the lead on this, and I had coworkers closing the trail on either side, making sure visitors don't walk through. And as bear management, we're trying to scare them away. So like I didn't have a firearm with me or even a paintball gun or anything. I'm just trying to like yell at the bear or chase it kind of. And she was being a good mama and she was not moving. And so I'm trying to like get her to move and she bluff charged me, which is a little frightening for sure. And we were taught to either hold our ground or run back at her. I held my ground, but like I was definitely a little not in my stomach. I'm like, oh man. Black bears are pretty much will always just do bluff charges. I mean, it's very rare that they actually attack humans at all. But yeah, that was definitely one event that I will always remember.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Steven has another question in the chat. He says they've lived in an orchard west of Winters for 40 years. We saw a bear for the first time on our lawn last week. We're surrounded by walnut and citrus trees. Any advice if that bear should come around again?
Yeah, that's tough. Bears are out, so like I said, they're more expanding. A way to keep bears out of like food and stuff like that, man. Oof. Um, yeah, dogs are very useful, honestly, like guard dogs or something like that, but you want to make sure like they can't have a chance to climb those trees. I don't have a lot of experience to be honest with like agricultural and like bears, but like it's definitely there's definitely stuff and information and research out there that you could definitely look into to see how you could deter those bears. I would definitely look into that.
Okay. So I think I had another question. California, we just have black bears. You're up in Yellowstone now, where there are grizzlies and black bears, right?
Mhm.
Um, are there differences in how you approach managing those two different bears?
Yes, very much so. Grizzly bears, you pretty much always want to make sure you have like a firearm on you when you're trying to scare them away or haze them away because they're not quite as mild-mannered as black bears. They can get angry much quicker and they're much more powerful than black bears. Um, as well, like when you're hiking in Yellowstone, you always gotta have bear spray on you. It's against the law in California, and you don't really need it for black bears, in my opinion. But grizzly bears, you definitely need it. I mean, you always got to make sure when you're hiking that you're loud, you're saying "Hey bear" or you're talking loud with your friends. Hiking groups of 2 to 3 or larger. I would definitely recommend. And if you're camping, like you got to make sure like you keep your food away and stuff like that, like I mentioned before. So definitely different. Like black bears, when I would haze them and chase them away, I would get a lot closer to like I would like run after them or chase them, or sometimes even in Yellowstone we use like flags that make a large whipping noise or whatever. But black or grizzly bears, you want to keep that distance. Make sure you have like a fire, like it's usually a firearm that has non-lethal rounds in it, just in case like it won't move as well or something like that. Because obviously we're not trying to kill them right away, we're just trying to scare them. So yeah, we keep our distance for sure, and we're not as aggressive with like chasing grizzly bears away.
Got it. All right. I've got a few minutes left here. Does anyone have any final questions for Dan? While folks are percolating on some final questions, I'd like to get a plug in for our next Nature and You lecture, which is going to be coming up at the end of May on May 28th. That's going to be with Max Stevenson, who is with the Solano Water Agency. He's the Puda Creek stream keeper, and he's going to be talking about salmon on Puda Creek. So it'll be another interesting wildlife talk, I think. All right, so we've got a few more questions. So Larry is asking, and I've wondered this myself a few times, how effective is bear spray, really?
Very effective. Like there's definitely research about how effective it can be. I mean, one thing you got to remember is you got to think about the wind when you're deploying it for sure, because you don't want the wind to be blowing in your face, and you don't want to spray it like obviously when they're too far away. But I mean, if they're coming at you, like getting closer, then I would deploy that like every time. Like you don't take the risk. Like deploy that bear spray. And one thing to know too about bear spray, it's not like bug spray. Like, so you don't want to spray your stuff, your tent, whatever like that. It's only for when like a
Oh,
bear is coming towards you or something like that. I've had visitors in parks that spray their campsite with bear spray, and that's not how
oh
that
no.
works. And there's lots of angry campers.
Gavin's wondering, I guess there's a recent video of a bear in Southern California displaying some aggressive behavior. Do you think that was potentially a bluff charge, or have you seen the video he's talking about?
Yeah, I think I have. I think it's the one where the guy's like jumping up and down with like a bear bell on him or something like that. And there's a bear on the trail. And yeah, I mean, it's probably because like the bear really had nowhere to go, and I mean the hiker could have been way more aggressive, like explain how I was. He wasn't yelling. I'm honestly not a big fan of bear bells. Like I kind of think like it's like a dinner bell for bears, like joking around, but like it's not nearly loud enough. If it's like a small jingle that like a bear will hear, and like it's probably makes him more curious than anything. So I'm sure that bear was just like probably the guy surprised it around the corner, and obviously the black bears almost never do like an actual like charge. It was almost guaranteed a bluff charge. I'm sure the guy was fine. He definitely could have done a better job to like try to scare the bear away instead of jumping around.
All right. Very good. Well, thank you, Dan, again for a great lecture and an informative Q&A session. Thanks to all of you for attending the lecture. We hope to see you again at our next lecture at one of our other upcoming events. We have a couple wildflower tours coming up. Spaces are filling up fast for those, so be sure to head on over to our events page and sign up if that is something that interests you. All right, thanks again, everyone, for coming
I'm
out and
I'm gonna
have.
jump
Oh,
into I'm the president of Tuleyome and I want to thank you guys all for coming. And just keep us in mind for Big Day of Giving. That's coming up and with your support, that keeps us doing amazing work out in the region. So thank you, thank you. And Dan Ruka, thank you so much. This was
Mhm.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.